So we didn't gain a ton of followers or subscribers during our first year as a podcast, but I feel like we did get some momentum, only to be struck by a couple situations that meant we need to put a pause on Among the Noise. The space we used for our podcast was my one-person apartment, which meant that we'd have a full podcast setup with tables and microphones and cords in my living room 24/7, or we'd have to set up and tear down every time. I opted for the latter since our podcast was only monthly. I wanted my living room to be, livable. Unfortunately, the process of getting it all set up, recorded, and then torn down meant that it was a 2 to 4 hour process every time, depending on various things. David also got super busy towards the end of that summer, and he ended up not being able to show up early to help set up every time, and maybe not stay in to help tear down every time. So it just got longer and longer, and so I think we just got burnt out for that process. That brings me to my next problem, and that is I ended up moving from that place, which you'd think would be a good thing, but it was due to them increasing my rent, and I couldn't afford it because I accumulated a lot of debt due to bad decisions. So I ended up making the difficult decision to move in with my parents temporarily, get some things paid off, just set myself up for success for my next place, so I can really just go all in on the podcast, the studio, and all that kind of stuff. So I found a place that has a second bedroom that I'm going to dedicate completely to just being a studio for the podcast or my music or a few other things. But in the meantime, I just didn't want to compromise the quality of the podcast by recording in suboptimal places like my parents' house with their loud dogs or whatever. I'm currently recording this in my car because of that. So we made a decision to put a pause on the podcast until we can achieve that goal properly. I can confirm I officially have a place I'm moving into, but it won't be until October, unfortunately. So throughout this past year, I've been working on a ton of other projects, big and small. There may be some restructuring happening to this podcast, but I'm hoping that will be for the better. We'll have more guests, we'll keep topics a little more generic, but it may end up being a lot more fun in that regard for us and the audience. In November, I'll be starting a new podcast focused completely on Star Wars. We tried to do that here to test the waters a little bit, but David doesn't keep up with much media, so he couldn't quite participate in those discussions as deep as I wanted to go with them. And if we go too deep, it'll throw off the cadence of the rest of the podcast that we had set. So if you're a Star Wars fan, stay tuned for that announcement. I'll mention it here for sure at some other point. So all of that is why the podcast has been on sort of a hiatus over the last year. In the meantime, I've been capturing our gaming sessions, getting clips, just to get something entertaining on the channel. However, game clips and podcasts are very different things, so I apologize to anyone that subscribed here for the podcast but are only seeing game clips now. That was the motivation behind making this episode, to publicly let you all know that the podcast is still here, we're still here, and there are plans to continue, hopefully better than ever. If you're new here and this is the first episode you're listening to, welcome. Hopefully this doesn't scare you off. Our podcast is about gaming and tech news, but not necessarily. It's hosted by myself, Brad, and David, who's not here for this one, it's just me. Hopefully you check out our other episodes to get a feel for what it's like, and now you know that it'll be even better soon. That's all I have to say for this one, just a little update. I'm chomping at the bit to get started again, but October is still so far away, so I figured I should get this out there for now. Just know we appreciate you all, and see you in the next one.